Okay, welcome back to the 13th and final lesson of the reliability of the scriptures. We're going to be talking about the period of the Exodus, well, the period of the patriarchs, actually. We talked about the period of Exodus last time. So tonight we'll be talking about the period of the patriarchs and back through the early parts of Genesis. We're not going to get into a lot of detail in the kind of proto-historical period of the flood and the creation, because that's sort of prehistoric in a lot of ways. So it's hard to judge the historical reliability of something that happened before things were historically reliable. But we're going to look at the story of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and see what things we can learn from it. Just a bit of a correction. I don't know if we mentioned it a couple of lessons ago, or last time, but the death of Joshua, I think I said at one point that it might have been around 1390 BC, but there's a better estimate, which would really be around 1356, right? So if Joshua, as the Bible said, lived to 110 years old, if he was a young man of around 20 or so during the time of the Exodus, that would be 1446, so he would die about 1356. And so that means that from the time they went into the Promised Land, right, in around 1406, until the conquest was over, until Joshua died, that's about 50 years that they were working in conquering Canaan, right? So it's clearly not just this really quick takeover. It was a slow process that even after 50 years, they still had a lot of land to take over. So that's something we have to consider when we're developing and looking at the theories and ideas for how to interpret the archaeological evidence, is to understand that it took a long time for the conquest, and so we should expect it to be a slow encroachment of the Israelites on the land. We talked about the slavery in Egypt, the Semitic slaves being used for brick making at the very time of the Exodus in 1446. Now, the picture that we saw was down in Thebes at the Temple of Karnak, and it was maybe not Hebrew slaves, but some other kind of Semitic people, but still it shows that they were there doing the very same thing that the Bible says they were doing, the very same time that the Bible says they were doing it. So that's pretty good for history's sake, especially when we consider the arguments that, no, this never happened, there wasn't anything like this, this was written 1,000 years later. If it was written 1,000 years later, how did they know that this was the exact period of time when slaves from this region of the world were doing this kind of work? Right? That doesn't make any sense. But if it was based on a real story, then yeah, we know that that's when it came from. When we talk about the Egyptian chronology, we can look at Thutmose III or Amenhotep II as the pharaoh of the Exodus. I favor Thutmose III a little bit more, but can mention Amenhotep because it's going to depend on the chronologies and the years, the ways that you parse them out based on star sightings and such. Now, Kenneth Kitchen, in his book, when he's talking about the patriarchs in the period there, he identifies 28 factors that link Genesis 11 to 50 with the early second millennium, right? So this is 11 to 50 is going to be the story of Abraham, the genealogy there, starting with Abraham's family, on to the end in the time of Joseph. The early second millennium is, the first millennium is from 0 to 1,000, and you go from 1,000 back to 2,000. So the early second millennium is around the year 2000 BC, right? 2000 and 1900. So a lot of the things, that's when this story is taking place. According, we go back from our Exodus a few hundred years. And so most of the evidence indicates that this is when it comes. There are some points that, again, might come from a later period, but not necessarily, right? So that then, when we consider those factors, that puts the story of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph strongly into the category of real history, right? Real biological, historical narrative. Biographical narrative, right? This is something that really happened, a story about them. these weren't details invented thousands of years later when they had no knowledge of these different things that were going on, right? There had to be some kind of story going back to that period. You might say that it wasn't in the final form that we have it today, thousands of years before, but no one's actually claiming that, right? No one's claiming that Abraham wrote these things or that Joseph wrote these things. At the oldest, someone's saying Moses wrote it, right? So it doesn't go all the way back to the original source. It was inspired, and if it came through some sort of oral tradition, that doesn't change the fact that it is true and from an older time period. So the number one factor that he identifies, the first one, is this pastoralist groups, right? These tribal groups of shepherds that with their flocks and herds that are traveling all over Mesopotamia, right? This is something that happened in the early second millennium, right? The land was open. They could move, thousands of kilometers over the course of their lifetimes, and really range in all these different areas along the river and down into that, we call it the Fertile Crescent, right? Because you got Mesopotamia and then the Jordan area and down into kind of Egypt and a big desert in the middle of that. So this is the area that they moved through. And if you go back and you look at things like the Mari archives, right, this ancient civilization in Mari, we see the Mari Yamina. It says it covered almost all of the area described in the travels of Abraham and Terah. Right, so there are historical records of these people traveling around, and they're traveling in the same places that Abraham is said to have traveled. Right, so that doesn't mean that they're Abraham, but it shows that these kind of people were living in this kind of way, in this kind of place, and that matches exactly what we see in the biblical account. Now that's is kind of a minor detail in some ways, but it's the starting point of the story, right? Another interesting point is long-distance marriage arrangements, right? So we see that in the story of Abraham. When he's getting old and he's about to die, he sends, or at least he thinks he's about to die, he sends his servant to go get a wife for Isaac. When Isaac is old and he wants his son Jacob to escape his brother, he sends him far away back to the family to make these arrangements. Those same sorts of things are seen in that period between the kings of Assyria and the kings of Mari, right? These people up in the north, writing each other, assigning, and making marriage arrangements. That's not an uncommon thing for that time period. Then there's another thing here. The third point is that this very particular period between 970 BC and 1540 BC, right? That's 430 years. That is the only time where the pharaohs of Egypt had royal residences in the Delta area, right? And so when we see the story where Abraham comes down and goes to Egypt and, meets the pharaoh and is with him there in this area, and he's got his flocks and his herds, right? You bring your flocks and your herds down to lower Egypt, right? That's not going to work. There's no place to range them. But up in the Delta area in Goshen, there's water, there's grass. They can survive there, right? And so this is where Abraham encounters Pharaoh. This is where Jacob encounters Pharaoh. 1,000 years later, Pharaoh's not there. Pharaoh's going to be in a different place, right? So it wouldn't make sense for Abraham to go down with all these flocks and visit him and get even more flocks and come back. That's part of the story. So this interesting time period that ends really just before the period of the Exodus, right? As the royal residences move down. And so we can kind of see that the change of different kings and dynasties happening parallel to the Bible account. Then we go back between 2000 and 1750 BC, right? Kitchen says this is the one and only period during which extensive alliances were common in Mesopotamia, right? Between Mesopotamia and its neighbors. So Mesopotamia is just a Greek word for between the rivers, right? So we've got the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. There were these civilizations there. And so when we read in Genesis 15, for instance, I believe it's 15, the account of the kings of Elam and coming down and attacking the king of Sodom and Gomorrah, and they defeat them, and they take Lot captive and bring him back up. It's Genesis 14, excuse me. And there's an alliance of 4 kings against 5, right? And some of these kings are from really far away. Well, there's a very short window of time where that took place, right? So again, if someone's writing this story 1,000, 2,000 years later, it's not going to make any sense to talk about these kings traveling thousands of kilometers to come and make an alliance against some other kings. They didn't do that, right? They had kind of withdrawn from that. There was a whole nother empire that was involved there, right? But to know the kings of these different empires and that their names match up with what we would expect, and their actions are matching up with what we would expect from people in a very specific time period, then that's showing us that this story is based in the reality of the early 2nd millennium BC. It can't come from any other time period after that. And so this is a point of history there in Genesis chapter 14. In fact, by 1700 BC, right, the eastern realm of Elam had stopped intervening in Mesopotamia altogether. So Elam is kind of the furthest east, right? It's almost to where Ur or something is, right, where Abraham was from. And so they had stopped sending their armies all the way to Syria, much less beyond Syria down into the land of Canaan and around the Dead Sea area, where we see the conflict with the king of Sodom and Gomorrah and that the valley down there. So they didn't do that after that time period, right? So that's another point, right? We see them kind of pulling back and having their own issues in their land. Then we've got the text of Yakadun Lim of Mari, right? Now this is accounts of battles and similar things going on between these different groups of kings. And it's very similar to what we see in Genesis chapter 14. Again, this is not saying that this is the same event recorded somewhere else, but what we're seeing is that there's patterns of the way that it's written, right? So that the account of Genesis 14, not only is it talking about factual events that could only have happened in a certain time period, but the way that it's written is written in a pattern of you make a raid, and then this group is made vassals, and then there's a revolt, and then there's another raid, and they have a victory, and then there's a religious celebration, and then other acts are recorded. Right? This is exactly the way that it's recorded in the story of Genesis, right? And so when Abraham, so we've got these guys, these big kings come down, and they attack, and they capture these guys and make them vassals, right? Then later on, these guys revolt and fight back, so they have to come and capture them and carry them away. But then Abraham goes after them, and he gets them back and brings them, and then he meets Melchizedek. So there's all these elements of the story that fit a pattern of that type of writing in that time period, right? And so, it's not that, these people later were copying this, or they're trying to reproduce the same story. It's just that's the way things were recorded at the time, right? And so it's not like that much later necessarily, but we see it like that at that earlier time period. So that, again, gives us a historical connection back to this same time period as the civilization in Mari. The kings in Genesis 14, I mentioned this in passing, but we've got Kedorlaomer of Elam, we've got Tidal of Goyim, we've got Amraphel of Shinar, and Arioch of Elasar. These guys each have appropriate names for their countries and their time period, right? Now, I'm not sure how many of these guys we might actually have records of, right? I don't know that we necessarily have, we can look in the records and say, there was a Kedorlaomer of Elam, or there was an Amraphel of Shinar. I don't think our records are that good. There might be some possible references to them that we do have, but we know based on other names from those places that they are appropriate names, right? And so that's good evidence, again, that this is not some story made up by somebody living 1,000 years later, 1,000 kilometers away, some priests or something, but this is really history, a historical account from the time that it was claiming to be written in. When we look at the treaties in Genesis chapter 21, in Genesis chapter 26, in Genesis chapter 31, these correspond to the structure of treaties that were discovered at Mari, again, and that tell Leilan. So, again, these are treaties that Abraham is making, right? That Isaac is making, that Jacob is making. We don't, in the Genesis account, we don't have the full, we might say official treaty, right? They're clearly they have said more in real life, in person, than we have written down. Just like when we have a lot of the sermons of Jesus, Jesus didn't just get up and talk for 5 minutes and then he was done, right? He's been teaching these people for hours and hours. Or Peter in Acts chapter 2, he's got this speech, and then with many other words he encouraged them to do this. Or we don't know everything that he said, but the format that we do have matches this format that we've discovered in the same time period, but in a slightly different area, right? But Abraham had moved through that area. There was a common culture with a lot of these guys. And so that's another link, right? And again, that format of that time period is distinct from earlier ones and from later ones, right? So it's a limited scope, right? We've said, man, this really lines up with what we'd expect for this time and this place, right? That's one of the things. If we don't have maybe explicit evidence, right, we can go back and say, well, is it what we would expect from that time and that place? Just like when we looked at the Gospels, the Jewish names in the Gospels match the Jewish names from the first century in Palestine, right? In frequency, in disambiguation, right? They don't match the names for Egypt. They don't match the names for 200 years later. So it shows us, man, that really goes back to that time, right? There's some connection there. The ninth point that he makes is that the price for Joseph, right, in the Bible was listed as 20 shekels of silver, and he says that was about average, right? If you go and look in the Mari archives, you look in the laws of Hammurabi, 22 shekels was about the average. Now there were some different values based on how old you were, maybe what country you were from or something like that, male or female. There's a lot of variation there, right? But what we have for Joseph was right for that time period. And the important thing is, again, the time period. If you go back before the time of Hammurabi, if you go back before the time of Joseph, the price was only 10 shekels for the same slave. We've got older records that show that. And if you get later on, right, to the time of the Nuzi tablets, there's a price of 30 shekels, right? Which, again, that corresponds to what we see in Exodus chapter 21, verse 32. If a slave dies, I believe if it's killed by some accidental way or something, you owe the owner of that slave 30 shekels, right? Because that was the price of a slave. That was the value of the slave. And so you can actually see this in the historical record, this inflation, right? Because the shekel's the same amount of silver, it buys you the same amount of stuff, but over time, the value of that goes down, and so the price goes up, right? And what we see is we've got an older value of 10, we've got in the Mari archives 20, we've got in the Nuzi tablets later 30, and in the Bible we've got 20 in the time of Joseph, and 400 years later in the time of Moses we've got 30, right? And so that matches with exactly what we see in the historical record. And in fact, if you go forward to the time of Assyria, you get to 50 shekels. And that's what we see in 2 Kings chapter 15, verse 20. There's a ransom that has to be paid. Each man, I believe, has to pay 50 shekels. Let me go ahead and read that just to make sure. 2 Kings 15, verse 20. Menahem exacted this money from Israel. Every wealthy man had to contribute 50 shekels of silver to be given to the king of Assyria. So the king of Assyria withdrew and stayed in the land no longer. Right. So Pul, king of Assyria, invaded the land of Israel. And so that's 4 data points on the price of, a person or a slave. And 3 of them we have biblical references for that all match the time frame, right? So and it shows the pattern of inflation. So that's just a really great one. And again, that spans Genesis, Exodus, and Second Kings, right? That's it's not just one book or one place. It combines all of this and shows the series of it. If all of that was written by somebody in in Josiah's time, right? They might know the price of a slave, in Menahem, because that's only 50 years earlier. But how are they going to know what the price of the slave was 1,000 years earlier, right? And before that, it doesn't add up. But what we have is a historical record. The 10th point that he makes, the connection, is that various social practices which changed in later periods match the early 2nd millennium BC. All right, so if you go back to Genesis chapter 15, verse 2, we've got Abraham saying, God, I don't have a son. What are you going to give me? Everything in my house is going to go to Eliezer of Damascus. Eliezer of Damascus was his servant. He had been made an heir by adoption. Right? And this was a practice that only existed in that time period. I mean, maybe it did exist later on, but this was commonplace in the early 2nd millennium BC. As you get later on, that doesn't happen nearly as much. Having heirs by proxy was another thing, right? We've got, you can't have a son, well, I'll take Hagar as a wife, and then she can have a child for Sarah, or Jacob, when he was married to Rachel and Leah. Rachel couldn't have children, so she brought Bilhah, and then when Leah stopped having children, she brought Zilpah. And so Jacob gets all these wives, but the children don't count for Bilhah and Zilpah, they count for Rachel and Leah, right? So there's kind of this heirs by proxy from these other wives. And so there were legal arrangements, actually, that were made when slaves wanted to produce children, right? If the wife wasn't capable within a certain time, so you might get married, and it's kind of made into the contract that if your wife can't give you a child by a certain time, then you can take another wife as a slave as another wife, and bear children for her. And then there's different kind of treatment for children of the various wives, right? And that's going to vary depending on the time period and the laws that were in place and the customs in those times. And what we see with the biblical account is that, again, it matches what we would expect for that early time period, right? Whereas later on, things changed, right? They had different practices, different customs. But the ones in the Bible match the early 2nd century ones, or at least the ones here in the story of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob match the early 2nd century, as we would expect them to be real historical accounts and not just legends made up later on. Because, man, these guys must have done some really good research to get all these minor historical details right for their legends. Number 11, the Patriarchal Religion, right? Things with Abraham and Isaac and the way that it operated, it followed the early 2nd millennium usage, right? So things change over the years. So in the early 2nd millennium, they did things one way. Later, things would change. There are 6 different ways that those were different. I don't have those right now. Let me just search for that real quick. Because I feel like there should be more information on that, but I don't have the slide right now. Let's go on to the next one, though. Geopolitical description of Canaan matches that of the Egyptian extraction texts. All right, so you can go back and look at these various Egyptian texts back from the early 1800s BC, 1860, 1830, 1870. And so they're talking about the land of Canaan, right? They're talking about, again, this is not talking about Egypt. This is talking about the land of Canaan, but they're Egyptian texts. So what was life in Canaan like? Well, there weren't any Egyptians there at that time. And I mean, maybe they went through there, right? But that's what we see, right? The Egyptians come up, like, for instance, when Jacob dies, and Joseph brings this great funeral group up to Canaan, the Canaanites are kind of marveling that there's all these Egyptians there, right? And they're like, wow, they're having this really solemn ceremony, right? But some other things. There's no overall monarchies, right? There's there's some kings in different places, right? But they're not ruling big areas. That is what we see later on, right? In the period of the Israelite kings, they're controlling the whole area, right? But at that time, it was smaller groups, right? It was more pastoral. We have guys like Abraham. He's very wealthy. He's considered a prince among the people, right? But he doesn't have any kind of royal title or anything. He doesn't have any real authority other than what he can just produce from his wealth and his reputation. But that was in that time. Again, there's no Philistine Pentapolis, right? So the 5 cities of the Philistines: Gath, Ekron, Ashkelon, Gaza, and I can't remember the other one, but there are 5. And they didn't exist yet. Or they might have existed, but they weren't Philistine cities at that time, right? When Abraham comes in, there's no Philistines there. Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, no Philistines, right? It's not till they come back in the time of the conquest that the Philistines have come in, right? And that matches with the waves of the sea peoples coming from Crete and settling on the coast there in that place. And so there's tribal lands, there's pasture lands going on, and so that's what we see during that particular time period. So let me get down through here real quick. Let's see if I can find the patriarchs and religion here. Maybe I can come back to that a little bit later. But there were several different ways that the religion differed, right? There was the content and forms that they had going on, the sacrifices and the use of altars that we see. There weren't these. The problem is, a lot of the texts that we have are from Mari and Ugarit, these massive urban centers, right? And so there was going to be a big organized religion in places like that. But these guys, these pastoralists and nomadic people, they didn't have records like we're in the big cities, right? So things were a little bit different. But things like sacrifice of sheep, different kinds of them, of lambs, those are very common. There were the use of different things like El Shaddai and terms like that. The deities that are being worshipped, that's not too uncommon to have a name of a deity that might change depending on where it's being worshipped. Talking about El Shaddai or Yahweh, like how are you going to refer to this? Even monotheism was starting to come in later on in Egypt, but it wasn't the only place that monotheism ever existed. And again, we see the rise of monotheism in Egypt just after we would expect this big, just after the Exodus and all this energy of God working and doing these things that might have led some people into monotheism. All right, let's go on to number 13. We've got some proper names, right? Names like Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. These are early West Semitic imperfectives, right? That's the technical term for these types of names. And what that means is these are names that are related to words, right? Like Ishmael, Isaac. Isaac means he laughs, right? They have and they're connected to the name of a god, right? We kind of lose it with the J and the I, but the Y sound at the beginning is connected with Yahweh, right? It's also connected with other things, but We get Israel and these different names that come up. But these are very common names in the early second millennium, right? Maybe about 55% of the names. But then if you get down later on to the last half of the second millennium, it's only about 30% of the names. And if you get down to the Iron Age, which is, the time of, some of the last judges and David and Solomon and such, it's only about 12% of the names, right? And you can kind of trace it through the Bible. We got this mass of characters that have this type of name back in the beginning, but then as you get further on, the names get more varied and they change their form. So that's another point again that with the names that it matches what we would expect for that period of time. Again, it's not all the names were like that, just about half of them that we see in the other records, but it's an interesting point. Another thing, the city of Ur, right? Abraham was from the city of Ur. This was not really an important place if you get further on in the history, right? So by the time of something like Josiah's time or something, no one would have cared anything about Ur, right? But if you go back to the early second millennium, there's evidence of these West Semitic pastoralists, right? West Semitic would be basically people from the western part of the Semitic areas, right? Semitic means descended from Shem, one of the sons of Noah. And so it's a particular place, but they had actually moved east out to the land of Ur, right? In that time period. And we know that they were there. And that's the group of people that Abraham comes from. That's the place where we expect him to be and the time where we would expect him to be. Whereas, again, any other time, it doesn't make sense. The land of Shinar, right? As mentioned, like we said in Genesis chapter 14, this was a Western term for Mesopotamia by the late second millennium. So, when you look at it, they used it at the right time in the right place. It's starting to shift where and when it's being used to refer to this area. So we wouldn't expect it from much later than that. When we look at the narratives of Joseph and the story of the Exodus, these use Egyptian words like words like shish for linen. Right? There's a later word in Hebrew that's I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's Beit, Vav, Tet, and then an S. I don't know if that's a Samic or I think it's probably Samic. But anyway, it's a different word, like by the 6th century. So by the time we get to Josiah and Ezra's time, they're using a different word for linen, right? So why would they use the word that's 1,000 years older, right? Unless they knew what it was. It's kind of one of these anachronistic things. Whereas in actuality, the story that we have, the word that they're using makes sense for people that are coming out of Egypt to use the Egyptian word for something, right? It's sensible. Whereas later on, there's a different Hebrew word for it. Then we look again at the Philistines, right? There's this term about the Philistines being in Gerar, right? Now, there's a bit of a problem with that because, well, there aren't supposed to be Philistines here yet, right? Like we said, there's no Philistines. So why do we see some Philistines? Well, the Philistines are also known as the Caphtorim, right? Because they come from the land of Caphtor. This is, so there's kind of a mix between the usages of things. And we do see some pottery coming down, right? In Syria and Palestine, and fresco evidence, in walls and different things that show art from these island nations, right? Like Crete, this Cretan kind of pottery. It's not very common, right? Again, there's no Philistine Pentapolis. There's not this big group of Philistines, but there might very well be some that have come, from time to time and may have established one city or a small village or something where Abraham or Isaac or Jacob could interact with them on a small scale. in the early years, and they're on friendly terms, right? Isaac and Abraham were both there and stayed with Abimelech for quite some time. And actually, if that's two different Abimelechs, then over the course of multiple generations, they're living and working around the Philistines. But the Philistines might just be kind of a later edit, you might say, just to when whoever's writing it later on, when there are Philistines living there, Moses writing it down, he's just kind of projecting this term back. Just like we might say, Filipinos, even though if we go back and we're talking about, Lapu-Lapu or something like that, would he want to be called a Filipino, right? I don't think so, right? Because that's the name that came later on, right? But we might refer to him that way to differentiate him from someone else. So then, if we look at the archaeological data for various towns mentioned in Canaan, right, we can see that there are these towns existing in the late and middle Bronze periods, right? So towns like Laish, Dothan, Shechem, Bethel, Jerusalem, Hebron, Gerar. Then if you go down into the Negev, you got Tel Mahata, Masos, and Farah south. So these towns are towns that we see in the biblical account. Jacob is there, Abraham is there, interacting with people. In some places, this is maybe the beginning of these sorts of towns, and this is what we see in the archaeological record. Right? They existed in the Middle Bronze period, which is when we expect them to be there. Then there's places like Beersheba. Right? That's not a town. Right? Not in the Bronze Age, right? Later on it becomes a town, but in the Bronze Age it's a well, right? It means well of seven. They dug these wells and they finally got a place to rest, and they came and made some odes there. There wasn't a city there yet, so we shouldn't expect a city there yet. They lived there as nomads, and that's where they got their water, right? Then if you go back to the story in Egypt, right? 110 was actually considered to be the ideal age in Egypt. There's this stuff maybe you hear that, Egyptians only lived to like the age of 30 or something like that. And some of them, maybe that's true, right? I don't know what the average age of an Egyptian was. But, in their own literature, they weren't all expecting to die young or something. They were looking forward to these things. Pharaoh himself, at the time of Joseph, was a very young man, so he might be very impressed by someone like Jacob, who was so old. But we see this, connection with this certain age. I mean, that's not a major connection, but it is at least an interesting one, that Joseph is recorded to have died at the very age that was considered ideal in Egypt, where he had spent so much of his life. If we go through point number 20, some people look at camels and they say, oh man, having camels here in this particular time period is anachronistic, it's wrong, there shouldn't be camels here. They didn't work like that. But if you consider it, camels are not actually very common in the biblical account, right? Abraham and Jacob did have some camels, but they were very wealthy men. And if you look at their things, the camels are kind of always listed last, right? It's kind of the smallest, least important of the herds. And so having a few camels traveling back and forth, we see them in artwork, we see them in writing of various periods. So they could happen anywhere in there. There's nothing to say, oh, there can't be camels. Because there were actually camels in that time period, and they were particularly useful on long journeys. Then the idea of feast and famine, right? That's sort of the theme of the end of Genesis, right? With Joseph going down and doing that even before Joseph, and the 7 years of abundance and 7 years of famine. There was, in the time of Abraham, there was famine, and that's why they went down to Egypt. It was very common for famine to strike the region and people go down to Egypt because that's where the constant water source was. The Nile River wasn't dependent on rainfall in Egypt. It was dependent on rainfall and snowmelt in Ethiopia and beyond. So it was reliable, every year almost. And interestingly enough, some of the greater famines actually happened when the Nile was at its height and flooded, and basically flooded out the crops and ruined them, more than not having enough water. That was a different kind of problem. But I mean, that was well known for 3,000 years, right? Way back to the time of the pyramids when they were being built, and they were built 1,000 years before Moses, right? So that's a very common theme in that part of the world, and so we would expect to see that multiple times in the accounts of those areas. Then religious celebration for a deity or deities after a military victory, right? Some people say, oh, there's too much theology in here, right? These guys do this, and then they attribute this victory to God or that victory to God, and everybody did that, right? All over the world. It doesn't matter who you are. You fast forward to the Roman period or something like that. It's completely all throughout history. People have been attributing their victories to various deities. So that's okay. That could be one for that time. It could be one for later. But it doesn't have to be some later revisionist thing where they're trying to create some new religion and give God credit for it. This was something that happened all throughout that time period. Then we've got some ancient cities such as Haran and Nahor, which might actually be like Nahor, right? These cities are known from the Mari archives. They were occupied for long periods, both before and after the patriarchs. So, where do these names come from? Did Terah name his children, after some city that he was going to or was in, or there's some interesting connections there. But these are old places, right? They're known, and the Bible talks about them, and these guys going there. And there's some other minor points that link the Genesis account to that period. I think I said he mentioned 28, but I'm not going to go into the other ones. Now there are some elements, right? I said that might come from a later time, right? And some that very clearly come from a later time, right? So they might be by some later editor or some scribe. There are multiple possibilities, whether it was some kind of marginal note or something that got incorporated into the text, or if the text that we have actually was written later based on older documents. That is a possibility, at least, that we need to contend with. But here are some of the elements, right? There's the mention of the land of Ramesses in Genesis 47:11. This is where they were staying and living. It wasn't known as the land of Ramesses in that period, right? In the time of Joseph, it was much later, even after the time of Moses. If we're considering Moses was the time of Thutmose III, then it wasn't called the land of Ramesses for another 200 or 300 years after that, right? So that had to come in by somebody else, right? Dan, for the city of Laish. This is Genesis 14:14. It wasn't called Dan, it was called Laish, right? Dan is the tribe of Israel. That place was called Dan because the Danites abandoned their inheritance in central Canaan and went up north of the Sea of Galilee and attacked this city of Laish and took it over, right? That's how we get from Dan to Beersheba, right? The northern extremity to the southern extremity of the land of Israel. But again, in the time of Moses, it wasn't called Dan because they hadn't taken it over yet. In the time of Abraham, it definitely wasn't called Dan. Dan hadn't even been born yet, right? So that had to have been put in by somebody later on, or God was like, oh yeah, sure, just put Dan there. Later on, they'll understand. I don't, but that maybe doesn't make much sense. So it seems it was probably added in by somebody, at least from Joshua's time or later, right? Then again, the idea of the Philistines referring to people from all of these Aegean islands, that is a later kind of thing. Earlier, like I said, they might have been called Kaftarim or Kretim or something like that, but from Crete. But using the term Philistines to refer to all of them, like we see the Philistines of Gerar, that seems to be a little bit anachronistic. But again, it's the same people, but that's not how they would have referred to them long ago. So it could have just been a revision later on to clarify to the readers, the current readers, what was going on. Just like, we might talk about any group of people that, they might have had a different name a long time ago, but we give them a new name now. And if we use the old name, we wouldn't know what we're talking about. Then there's possibly the form of the name of Potiphara or Potiphar. There's some arguments to be made that is not what we would expect from a name from that time period. Again, this isn't a sure one. There are some different possibilities in the way the names worked. But that is one argument that people might make, that this was a later invention. And then talking about Ur of the Chaldeans, right? The Chaldeans were the Babylonians, or the Babylonians and the Chaldeans came from the same people group. And so referring to Ur of the Chaldeans, there were a lot of Urs. That's kind of a later thing in some opinions. So where did that come from? I don't know. But again, these aren't necessarily, this story was made up, but there could have possibly been later edits or scribal changes that were introduced in the text that give us these sorts of things. Because unfortunately, the oldest Hebrew text that we have does not go back to the very time, or even 100 years later. It goes back only to the 1300s AD, right, or 1200s AD, which is less than 1,000 years ago. We do have some Dead Sea Scrolls, of course, and the Septuagint, which are much older, but they contain these same sorts of things. And finally, Genesis 36:31 mentions kings of Edom. Quote, before any king reigned for the house of Israel. So you might say, well, someone's only going to write that after there's been kings of Israel, right? Because why would you say the kings of Edom had kings before Israel had kings if Israel hasn't had a king yet? Which means that, this couldn't be written, this part of Genesis wouldn't have been written until, in the period of the kings. But by the same token, if Israel didn't have a king yet, yes, of course, Edom still had kings before Israel had a king. There's an expectation that there's going to be a king in Israel, right? There's laws given for what happens when you guys want a king. This is the kind of person that you need to make king. So that's built into the law already. So we don't have to say, they wouldn't have understood that. No, they understood the possibility of having a king, and so there's not yet kings when these kings of Edom existed. That's not difficult to understand, but it does present a question, at least, as to whether or not it might have been written later on. So based on all of that, 20-something points, and some of them overlap a bit, but it shows that the Genesis account, at least, is based on oral records that were probably passed down from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob to Joseph. Now, Joseph very easily could have written those down. The first alphabet was being developed in Egypt around Joseph's time and in the years following that. Definitely by the time of Moses, the alphabet had gained quite a bit of popularity because of its ability to be accessible by anybody, right? You didn't have to have a special education to write in these hieroglyphics or cuneiform or something that had very complicated forms. They were just a limited number of symbols. I mean, it's so easy to use an alphabet, right? Little kids do it. We can teach them when they're just 4 or 5 or 6 years old, right? It doesn't take much to teach kids an alphabet, and then they can start to read. So it was an amazing invention, and quite possible that actual written accounts came down to Moses and to the people after him that could be put together into these sources. So Moses could rewrite that. Joshua, the Hebrew script changed over time, so somebody's going to have to rewrite it in the new script in its present form, right? So any time in there, you might get some changes introduced. That's the problem of hand copying things, right? Now you might say, well, if it could have happened anytime, then we can't trust it. Well, there's something to that. But again, we look back at these things. How much do we think we can trust it, right? How much does it seem to get right? How much does it make sense? How much does it match up with the things that we see Jesus saying, with the things we see Jesus teaching? Jesus seemed to trust it pretty well, and the church trusted it, and we know pretty well that we have the same Bible that they did, so that's not really a big issue at this point. Now, if we go back a little further, right, and we consider some of the genealogies, right, there's a few points to think of, because there's a lot of genealogies in the Bible, especially in the book of Genesis. And so genealogies give us two different things, right? We give, the Bible gives us some different things. It'll give us genealogies to kind of span a certain section, and it'll give us this happened, there was peace for 80 years, or they were in Egypt for 400 years, or there's various things that pop up like that. So what we see in Genesis and Exodus is genealogies that have likely been abbreviated, right? That makes things a little bit difficult sometimes when you're trying to count up people and create these family trees and such. But when we look at what the Bible says between the time of Jacob, right, when Jacob went down to Egypt, and the Exodus was 430 years, right? But it was only spanned by 4 given generations, right? We only get 4 names in there. Now, there are some ways you can kind of try to fiddle with it and say, is all the time that they were in Egypt, well, the land of Canaan was part of Egypt in a way, and so maybe all the time that Abraham was living should be taken off of there. But at best, you're going to knock off 100 years, right? 150 years. So you've still got 4 generations spanning 350 years or 300 years. And that's a really long time for 4 generations, right? That's like over 80 years a person. That's not very likely. Seems like something is being skipped over. And so, for instance, in Exodus chapter 16, verse 16 to 20, we get Moses, him being the son of Amram, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, the son of Jacob, right? So if we just count that, Moses is the son of Amram, Kohath, Levi, Jacob, right? That's 4 generations to get back to Levi, right? But that's 430 years. That's kind of crazy, right? If Moses was 80 years old when they came out, then that's 350. How old was Amram when Moses was born? How old was Kohath, right? Levi was already alive when they went down to Egypt, right? And over 40 years old, right? So, that doesn't leave much. That's a really long lifespan for Kohath and Amram. Kohath might have already been alive when they went down to Egypt, right? So there's this question of, wow, how can we span this gap? How old was Amram? Like 300 years old when Moses was born? That doesn't make a lot of sense, right? But again, this is clearly not the case, because the text specifically says that some of Jacob's grandsons went with him down to Egypt, right? Sons of Judah, sons of Joseph. Joseph's sons were there down in Egypt already. It was a group. He had 12 sons, right? One of which was already in Egypt. And the group that went down to Egypt was like something like 70, 75 people, right? So it was him and his wives and his sons and their wives and like 50 kids, right? So there's something going on there. We have to find a better way to understand the genealogies that we see in the biblical account. Kitchen puts forward this idea of fourfold identity tags, right, or kind of a short form genealogy, right? So this is a way that you could identify a particular individual, right? You've got different categories. You've got the tribe, right? So Moses is from the tribe of Levi. Then you've got the clan that he's from. That would be from the clan of Kohath, right? Then what family group? That is Amram, specifically by Jochebed, right? So Amram might have had multiple wives, you don't know, but that's the family group that he's in. And then the individuals there would be Moses and Aaron, right? And Miriam, of course. But we can see that in the biblical record, right? And we can see those same kind of tags in Egyptian court records, right? So, and again, this is something that we see in many places throughout the Bible. So if we go over to Joshua chapter 7, verse 1, we get Achan, right? Achan is the guy who's stolen something from Jericho, and his sin is going to come back and cause him to lose at Ai. Cause Achan to lose his life. But Achan, right, he's from the tribe of Judah, and they call out the clan of Zerah and the family of Zimri, and then they get all the individuals to come forward, and Achan and his father Carmi come out of that, right? So we've got Judah, Zerah, Zimri, Carmi. That's the fourfold identity tag, and then Achan is the guy that's from that group, right? So that's pretty interesting. If we go Dathan and Abiram, right, in Numbers chapter 26, verse 5 to 10, right? They're from the tribe of Reuben, they're from the clan of Palu, they're from the family group of Eliab, and the individuals are Dathan and Abiram. So we get these guys. This is the arrangement there. And so when we go and we look at the Egyptian sources, right, we go back and look. There's a scribe named Mose under Ramses II. This is going to be around 1250 BC. He sued to repossess some land that had been given to his ancestor Neshi 300 years earlier, right? So here we've got this guy Mose suing to get some land. His ancestor is Neshi. There's a 300-year period between these two guys, and the record says Neshi, right, from the family of Wernuo, or the family line, from the family of who, right? And then the individual is Neshi and his brethren, or Mose and his brethren, right? So we've got this, again, this ancestor, the first part of the family line, the more specific family group, and then an individual, right? You can think of this as kind of just notable individuals. You don't have to put everybody in there, because, you know, some of these groups might die out, some of them might come together in different ways. And so knowing the main important names in there, you can trace it back pretty easily and keep track of things. So that is an interesting way to look at the genealogies there, that there might be a lot more generations, but we don't need to know all the intermediate ones. We just need to know that at some point it gets back to this clan, you know, we're in this clan, and then that goes back to Levi long before that, right? And we can kind of fill in the gaps. There's probably 8 or 10 other people in there to fill in that 300 years. But we don't know all of their names. But that's kind of a way to make sense of that, if nothing else. So now we get back to the Protohistory period, and we are getting pretty near the end here because we don't have much left. But the accounts of creation, right, the flood, the Tower of Babel, we don't have a lot of written records at that time, right? We've gone kind of before civilization in a lot of ways, right? But yet, each one of these stories, there are similar stories in different cultures all around the world, right? So if you go to the epic Sumerian story of in Merkar, right? It talks about this golden age, right, where everybody spoke the same language. But in that story, the god Enki came down and changed everybody's language, and that's why we got all these different languages, right? That's interesting because that's very similar to what we see in the biblical account, where everyone at Babel spoke the same language, but God didn't like it, so he came down and disrupted it and changed their language. Now, does that mean that the God of the Bible is Enki, the God of the Sumerians? No, but we have a similar story for the same event, right? But giving credit to different gods based on the culture. There's literally hundreds of ancient flood stories, right? I think there's 220 or something different flood stories from almost every culture all around the globe, right? So whether you're in China or North America, South America, Africa, all these people have some story about a flood that happened a really long time ago, and somebody had to build a boat or a raft or something to get a bunch of animals and escape. Right? It's all over the place. And if you go to somewhere like the Ark exhibit in the United States, somebody's built a full-size Ark, and they've got all sorts of stuff inside. But it's it's air conditioned, and they've got different displays and different things talking about stuff. But they've got a section there where they've got a map of the world, and they go through some of the different stories that have been talked about. Some of the more famous ones are things like the Gilgamesh epic and things like that. Now, all of these stories have different levels of detail, right? They're different stories, right? But to think that there was this universal story, right, that everybody in the world used to know about this particular event, that makes it seem like that's a pretty likely real event, right? For everybody to make up basically the same story. That seems a bit odd, right? That's an old story, the story of Noah. And the interesting thing about the biblical account is it's kind of the most straightforward, right? A lot of the other ones are really bizarre, right? There's gods battling and doing all sorts of stuff, and it's kind of chaos and different things are happening. But in the biblical account, God says, I'm just upset because people have become evil, and I'm going to just wipe them out with this flood. That's it, right? And he does it. And saves Noah and the ark, right? It's pretty straightforward. And so that gives some credence to the biblical account, right? It's kind of the most simplified form of it, right? The least embellished with all these kind of crazy details. Then the creation story also, right? We have these things all in various cultures. There's some interesting stuff if you talk to someone about ancient Chinese, right? And some connections between, what different Chinese symbols mean and Chinese words and how they connect with the biblical account, right? Of like a snake or a tree or a garden, and even the pictograms themselves of, different symbols combined together, mean something. And it's like, wow, that just really makes you think of Genesis when you start looking at those things. It's really interesting. But again, all these different cultures have some kind of creation story, but the Genesis account is one of the most straightforward, right? God said something, and it happened. There's no like this God split open another God and made half of the body, half our body into the land and the other half into the sea, or and there's some really bizarre stories, in the earth, like resting on a turtle or an elephant or a giant fish or something like that. There's just these crazy things that can't possibly be, right? But the biblical account is just simple, right? God says it, and it happens. It happens in a very orderly fashion, right? He creates the light, then he makes the land appear, he, does these things one after the other, right? Makes the sun and the moon and the stars, and then he makes the birds and the fish and the animals appear. It happens all in a set order. I guess the first one, no, that's what I missed. I missed the created the sky, right? So first we've got the light, then the water is separated, and we get the heavens, and then the land appears, and then on and on. But again, it's just by the power of God, not some weird spell or all sorts of chaos or whatever. God says it, it happens, it's good. Next day, right? Very simple, very organized, very interesting account of creation. And so, in conclusion, if we go back through all these things, right? Everything we've looked at for the Old Testament, all the things we looked at for the New Testament, the Bible is very firmly rooted in history from start to finish, right? Now, it's not that we can prove all these things exactly, but the probability is very high that it actually came from the time that it says it came from, right? The connection points that we see are very strong, right? And the Bible is important because it's the story of God dealing with a certain group of mankind, right? And he's going to explain how eventually he would come to earth as a part of his own creation and redeem us from our sins, right? He's not talking about all this other stuff. There's a whole lot of other things he could have talked about, a whole lot of other people he could have interacted with. But the Bible is a very particular story. It starts with Adam and follows his line, and gets to Israel and follows this particular line and, particular kings and such until we get to Jesus. That's the whole point. The whole Bible is leading us to Jesus Christ, right? And what God's plan was in that. And then, the church after that. So no other ancient work compares to the Bible in accuracy and importance, right? Now, of course, we can go back to these Mari archives and we can say, oh, I'm sure these are accurate because these are first-hand accounts, right? And we have them and they're very old. Well, okay, good, right? But again, that doesn't mean that they're 100% accurate, right? People make stuff up all the time, right? They embellish stories and do these different things. And so some of those need to be challenged as well. But how important are those stories? Well, they're great, but they don't lead to the salvation of mankind, right? So the Bible together, we see all this confirmation. We see the purpose of it. And that's why we need to go back and keep looking at it, right? And why we can have faith in it and confidence as we study these things and share them with others. So that's the end of our lesson on the historical reliability of the Scriptures. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's been helpful to you. Thank you for joining me.